Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from the Frontier, and thank you kindly for stopping by. I hope the week's gone well. It's certainly gone by. I'd like to thank the High Commissioner of the Republic of Pakistan and Mrs. Rafiuzaman Siddiqui for the invitation to dinner last night, and it was really most enjoyable. I met the Chinese ambassador for the first time, very articulate and much more forthright than his predecessor. The South Korean fellow, who was very interesting and gave me a perspective on what was happening in North Korea, and he says the only thing we know is that we know nothing. He definitely didn't feel that Kim was in charge. He thinks he's just a figurehead, so that was interesting. Very interesting Ghanaian man, Mensa, who's accredited to UN Habitat, but had very deep insights on Kofi Annan's negotiations in particular with the two sides of what then became the coalition government. And I thank the High Commissioner for that invitation. It was most enjoyable once I got there, because the traffic has just been awful all the way around Nairobi. Home thoughts. I've been immersed for a while in Don Delillo's world, and I'm sure you're all suffering from fatigue. But it's so luminous and prophetic. And for someone who saw things like the Iranian Revolution unfold in front of my eyes on my TV set, and found it more gripping than any cinema I've ever watched, and other big-ticket world events like that. And I sort of recall them like yesterday, and then you discover someone like Don Delillo, who writes about that newsreel from JFK's assassination, Libra, to all kinds, and he curates it in this extraordinary manner through his books. I found this description: Delillo's novels marked by the way in which word and image, film and televisual effects are reconfigured as aspects of an englobing media assemblage. That's spot on. The news is fiction, the news is the new narrative. In Mao too, the author lets Bill Gray comment on the same question. News of disaster is the only narrative people need. The darker the news, the grander the narrative. And then this quotation from this book, Mao too, which is so powerful. What makes this city different is that nobody expects to be in one place for 10 minutes. Everybody moves all the time. 7 nameless men own everything and move us around on a board. People are swept out into the streets because the owners need the space. Then they are swept off the streets because someone owns the air they breathe. Men buy and sell air in the sky, and there are bodies heaped together in boxes on the sidewalk. Then they sweep away the boxes. And another review from the Paris Review. In Mao too, I thought about, this is the writer who was explaining, I thought about the secluded writer, the arch-individualist, living outside the glut of the image world, and then the crowd, many kinds of crowds, people in soccer stadiums, people gathered around enormous photographs of holy men or heads of state. This book is an argument about the future. Who wins the struggle for the imagination of the world? There was a time when the inner world of the novelist, Kafka's private vision and maybe Beckett's, eventually folded into the three-dimensional world we are all living in. These men wrote a kind of world narrative, and so did Joyce in another sense. Today the world has become a book, more precisely a news story or television show or piece of film footage. And the world narrative is being written by men who orchestrate disastrous events, by military leaders, totalitarian leaders, terrorists, men dazed by power. World News is the novel people want to read. It carries the tragic narrative that used to belong to the novel. The crowds in Mao too, except for the mass wedding, are TV crowds, masses of people we see in news coverage of terrible events. The news has been full of crowds, and the TV audience represents another kind of crowd, the crowd broken down into millions of small rooms. It's an outstanding writing. You can see why I find him so fascinating. I'll put up a colour version of the picture of the mass moon wedding at Yankee Stadium, with which the first chapter of Delillo's novel that I read opens, and it starts off by these two parents in an audience. You're not sure what they're doing, but he's scanning the field. It's like a stadium. And gradually you realize it's a mass wedding, a moony wedding, and that he's looking for his daughter. And it's just such a powerful opening. It really is. He's an extraordinary writer. I'm going to put that photograph I took of Pemba, Mozambique, from the sky, because I do like it enormously. It's sort of dreamy and sort of wistful. Christian posted a whole bunch of photos from Eat Tweet 2, but they're on Flickr, so I can't pull them off there. The link is on Rich Wrap-Up, if you'd care to have a look. That was a most enjoyable evening. Of course, today it's all about D-Day, and I'll put up a D-Day front cover of Life. Then I jumped back to Tiananmen Square because of Mao Tzu. 25 years later, Tiananmen Square has become a contest of narratives. And really that's what the world is about in so many ways. China's current leaders are personally vulnerable because they trace their lineage to the winners of the power struggle that cleaved their party in 1989, said veteran China journalist Louisa Lim. Interesting point. And I certainly feel that they are more hard-edged than their predecessors. The leaders who have governed China since 1989 have emphasized a dictum attributed to Deng: the gunshots have afforded us 20 years of peace and opportunity for business. According to noted China expert Perry Link, the massacre has bequeathed the CCP this terrific inheritance. Deng Xiaoping's logic is that shooting to kill can ensure stability. If a massive opposition movement were to recur, Link added, the CCP would again face the choice of either a bloody crackdown or giving up power. Well, you know which way it would go. They will still use force. That's a racing certainty. Another tool that the CCP is using to consolidate its support base is nationalism. Said French sinologist Jean-Philippe Béja, Xi Jinping has raised the Chinese Dream slogan and bolstered China's position on the world stage. The CCP is relying on nationalism to uphold its legitimacy. Fair point, fair strategy. I'll put up a photograph of Tiananmen Square of the Tank Man, which is such an iconic photograph. And then another photograph from Reuters of soldiers from the honor guards of the Chinese People's Liberation Army marching in front of Tiananmen Square after the welcoming ceremony for Kuwait's Prime Minister Sheikh al-Sabah. Bloomberg View is saying how Xi likes Putin, who's the first foreign leader he met as China's president, and calls him his good friend. And I must admit, I think this twin-sided pivot, both to Asia and China, which is really a contained China strategy, and I thought that really at this point in time, the US, it's more urgent for the US to contain China, which is I think, a significantly bigger threat to US hegemony than Russia. And I think it was a little bit arrogant to do it sort of simultaneously, to be pivoting there and then Ukraine and Russia. And therefore was poor strategy and tactics, because it has allowed and pushed Xi and Vladimir into a triangulation trade of Barack Obama. But then, I suppose the US must believe their military superiority is so enormous that they can do such a thing. But I think tactically and strategically, I would prefer to play differently. If you look back at Nixon went to China, reached out because he realized that there are these three power points, and that 2 versus 1 is better to be part of the 2. Trucks packed with criminals and suspects in Yili, Xinjiang last month at a mass public sentencing, and that's taking me back to Mao Tzu, of course. A sort of mass event. US to beef up Black Sea presence after Crimea crisis. This is Hagel saying there's going to be a stronger presence of US ships in the Black Sea. We will sustain that tempo going forward, he said. He's been pretty strong-minded of late. Chinese military spending is expected to exceed $145 billion. It says the US. I like this photograph. It's called Chandelier, and it's obviously from one of Saddam Hussein's palaces. The bone of contention between Obama and Francois Hollande is really the sale of these Mistral small aircraft carriers. Quite difficult to build, enormously complicated and very potent, says Peter Roberts. It's a one-stop shop for intervention. First function is to deliver helicopters either for close support or bring troops to the front. Each ship can carry 16 large helicopters with 6 on deck at a time. Each wave of 6 can carry up to 250 troops 125 miles inland before returning to pick up more. As soon as the first wave leaves, the next 6 helicopters are brought up from the hangar in elevators. The ship can accommodate 700 troops, plus crew and basic comfort. And it's this Mistral, which is, I'm sure, a bone of contention over dinner. Last night, I'll put up a photograph of President Obama, Francois Hollande, John Kerry. You can see Susan Rice is back. La Ciberta, I haven't heard of it, must be good. ECB President Mario Draghi, of course, reduced the deposit rate to minus 0.1% from 0, making the institution the world's first major central bank to use a negative rate. Policymakers also lowered the benchmark rate to 0.15% from 0.25%. Promise of further measures. But the price action on the foreign exchange markets was very interesting. Let me get to that. Last time I checked, the euro was around 136.28. And then for the euro, it was the usual buy the rumor, sell the fact story. It sold off and then bounced sharply. Dollar index came off the top, fell 0.4% from a 4-month high, last trading at 80.347. Now, it had gone to the top of the range, but it really was a story of euro weakness rather than dollar strength. However, against the yen, we've seen the dollar strengthen 102.32. Its dollar's gained 0.6% this week, and that's on yield differentials. You've had a back up in the US yield curve, and that's made it more attractive to hold dollars. Swiss franc 0.8917, pound bounced back over 168, 168.09. Aussie had a big bounce, 0.9334. India rupee 59.215. South Korean won 10.2020. That's a multi-year high. Brazilian real 226.11. Egyptian pound stable at 7.1492. And the South African rand probably has more to bounce here, 10.6889. The dollar had rallied 1.4% in the past month, but I think that's going to be given up now. Euro weakened 0.8%, yen had appreciated 0.7%. I'll put up a 3-month chart of euro dollar. Draghi said, we think it's a significant package. Are we finished? The answer is no, so tough talk out of him. The magnitude and multifaceted nature of the stimulus suggests that the ECB's main goal here is to take a chainsaw to the euro, but the markets are just laughing at Draghi's slasher mask. And that's a good way of putting it. Germany's DAX topped 10,000 yesterday for the first time. So very interesting price action yesterday. Euro buying, peripheral outperformance, sterling, the Aussie, DAX over 10,000, telling me that really the market isn't yet ready to buy the dollar in a big way. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the dollar index and a 5-day chart of sterling, so you can see the sharp run up, and that's a proxy for other peripheral currencies. Gold 1254.93, a bit of short covering, I think, after quite a sharp sell-off. Crude oil 102.54. Volumes really were down 70% less than the 100-day moving average. Prices down 0.3% this week. It's at the top end of the range. You can squeeze up to 105, 105.50, but I think it's expensive. Interesting, isn't it, that the Hogs futures, which is pigs, for July delivery gained 44% this year. And that's versus commodity index, which is up 2.2%. All country world index up 4%. And this is all around a virus which is 100% fatal for young piglets, which apparently is decimated by about 10%. Emerging markets, remember I was plugging that you should be buying Russia when all this was picking up. And now Bloomberg is saying, when some investors were fleeing Russian stocks as President Vladimir Putin moved to annex Crimea, PIMCO turned bullish. Micex dividend yield on March 14, when I actually said it, you should be buying it the last trading day before Crimeans voted to join Russia, was 4.59%, whilst the gauge traded at 4.56 times estimated earnings. For the market's dividend yield to exceed its PE ratio, it's a very unusual thing. Since that time, dollar-denominated RTS index has rallied to 26%, so it really was a ludicrous price. And you often get that because you get restrictions. People just have to sell at any price, and then it just overshoots to the downside as much as it can overshoot to the upside. And I was arguing, telling Christian that I thought Russia was a great buy, and he was horrified. And then I said to him, the markets and politics don't move in sync, and quite often, politics will blow up. But you're saying to yourself, the numbers are telling you something different. And really, when you buy Russia on a price-earnings ratio of 4 is, to me, a good trade. US envoy urges Congo's Kabila to respect law step aside in 2016. My comments in brackets are very low probability of this happening. Our strong advice is that there is a global election calendar with the presidential elections no later than the end of 2016, and that there should be no attempt to disregard the unamendable stipulation of Article 220. And he said that in Kinshasa, which is a bold kind of thing to be doing. South African all shares up 8.094% this year and is back above the 50,000 level for that index. Dollar versus Rand, 1068.89. Tepid rebound so far. I think it could get some more speed. Egyptian pound last trading at 714.78. Apparently Egypt is studying an international bond issue. The yield on their current $1 billion sovereign bond maturing in 2020 tumbled to 4.73% this week, its lowest level since December 2010, from a peak of 11.07% in June 2013. 5-year credit default swaps used to insure against the risk of an Egyptian sovereign debt default are at the lowest level since mid-2011. The black market exchange rate has appreciated by 6 piastres to 730 since the announcement of El-Sisi's win. That's narrowing the gap between the unofficial and the official rate, which is another good signal in the noise. The Egyptian stock market jumped 4.71% yesterday, and is now up 25.3% in 2014. The Nigerian all shares up 0.5831% this year. Ghana Stock Exchange is up 8.811% this year, but of course your returns have been eviscerated by the SEDI dumping. The second biggest faller this year, currency-wise, is the Zambian Kwacha, where the Bank of Zambia is now introducing new measures to try and stem a slide in the Kwacha, raised the overnight rate on May 30th. Currency is the second worst performing currency after the SEDI. All about the budget deficits. People are getting very uncomfortable where they're seeing a very big salary bill. And both Ghana and Zambia fell into that trap of increasing that salary bill by an eye-popping amount, thinking revenues would continue rising and the markets remained benign. And the markets have said, you know what, we don't like that. And that, in that sense, in 2014, we've seen a bifurcation. The market was much more generous in 2012 and 2013. So we've got to keep an eye on that. The central bank is saying speculating against the currency may result in heavy financial losses when the Kwacha reverts to an equilibrium path that is consistent with fundamentals, they said on May 29th. I caught up with the governor actually in Maputo. He's a very nice man. We spent some time together. He was very glad to see me and I was very glad to see him. Burundi is ready to send hundreds more troops to Central African Republic, where international forces are trying to put an end to sectarian violence, said the president. For smaller African countries, this is a very profitable venture, sending the soldiers. We've been asked by the African Union and the United Nations to raise the number of our troops in the CAR. We are ready to deploy 140 troops and have prepared 2 police units of a total of 280 officers. KKR has bought a rose farm in its first ever Africa deal. AfriFlora is an Ethiopian company that grows about 730 million of the flowers a year for export to Europe. KKR is investing about $200 million from its 6.2 billion European fund to buy a stake in the company. opens a new chapter for KKR, of course, did the hostile $25 billion leverage takeover of RJR Nabisco, which is the subject of a book, Barbarians at the Gate. So quite an interesting development that they're seeing their way into our markets, and it speaks to the demand side for Africa. It's quite strong. Kenyan US Embassy increases defences amid threat. The Marines stood behind a camouflaged sandbag bunker atop the US Embassy in Nairobi and scanned the horizon with binoculars. What he saw was a busy street that officials fear is full of targets for an attack by Al-Qaeda-linked militants because diplomatic missions are in the neighborhood. More than 15 years after Al-Qaeda destroyed the US Embassy in Nairobi with a massive truck bomb that killed more than 200 people, fear is rising that US diplomatic personnel and property could again be targeted. Armed Marines are now stationed on the embassy's roof, one indication of recent security upgrades. Intelligence has been circulating in the region that the last 2 months that American interests are the next intended target for Al-Shabaab, an Al-Qaeda-linked group in Somalia responsible for last year's attack on Nairobi's Westgate Mall. The terror group has also shown interest in attacking the US military base in Djibouti, just north of Somalia. There were indications that the US Embassy in Ethiopia was being considered as a target last year, said Matt Brighton. Ambassador Robert Godek last week told some 400 Americans at a town hall meeting, "We know that there's a threat and we know it's serious. Diplomats have indicated that global terrorists affiliated with Al-Qaeda are moving into the region." The embassy looks likely to scale back the number of US personnel stationed in Kenya, in part by reducing or moving the East African mission for the US aid agency, USAID. That's not a good sign, because that Muthaiga-Giri economy, of which I put the US, all the embassies into, and various other agencies, is a big piece of the GDP in Nairobi, and Nairobi is a big piece of the GDP in Kenya. Westgate was the first time there was really a Western target since 2002, Cotter told the US audience, referring to the September attack on an upscale mall by 4 gunmen that killed at least 67 people, many of them foreigners. In a statement to the AP after the town hall, Godek, who was stationed in Nairobi during the 1998 embassy bombing, said the embassy is continually evaluating its security posture and updating security based on threat information analyses. The embassy on Thursday told US citizens to be cautious in large groups at bars or restaurants, for instance, when watching the upcoming Soccer World Cup. Al-Shabaab detonated bombs in neighbouring Uganda as people watched the World Cup final 4 years ago, killing 17 people. The last month, an Al-Shabaab leader named Fuad Mohammed Khalaf, also known as Shongole, said Islam's flag will fly over Washington and New York. In an earlier speech, Al-Shabaab leader Ahmed Godane foreshadowed attack on French interests, Brighton said, which may have referred to a suicide bomb attack at a restaurant in Djibouti, where French forces are also stationed. The US Embassy sits across from the street from the UN headquarters in Kenya. Kenya recently deployed more security forces on the street. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, in a speech on Wednesday, said his government is committed to protecting the country. The military is planning to station troops on roads potentially used by Al-Shabaab to enter Kenya. Serious tests lie before us. My conclusions are we are seemingly into a new normal, about which I wrote on the 19th of May in that piece called "The Dashboard is Blinking Amber." And then on the 22nd of April, I was talking about the asymmetric risk presented by Al-Shabaab, where that crazy individual, Abu Bakr Shaka, if you read his body language, he's taunting, he's like some crazed individual. When he said, "We are in your city," to Good Luck Jonathan, and I said that comment could be made by Al-Shabaab as well. I'll put up that photograph I took of Westgate, which was then on fire. According to the prospectus, Kenya's economic growth will rise to 6.4% in 2014 from a forecast 5.8% this year. I think that 5.8%, I think we're going to be 1% lower, at the very minimum. Inflation in 2014 will be around 7.5%. But I've readjusted my range for this bond. I think they're going to have to raise $2 billion because I think we need some new money. I think you could get it probably 4 times oversubscribed. I think it's currently in a range of 7 to 7.375 is my yield range. But obviously that's a moving target with but I think we're going to see some strong demand. Not least because if you look at this other diagram I'm putting up of chronology of African bond issuance, there's very little issuance. I think there's a lot more demand. Kenya shilling was last at 87.55, a little bit of a bounce off that 2.5-year low above 88 that we saw. Nairobi all share up 9.2499%, 2.213% below an all-time high set on 12th May. NSE 20's had a poor run, down 1.8743% this year and at a February 20th low. But I think, from today we're going to see a turn higher because there's some liquidity coming through the Eurobond. Market feels a little bit better. I think, it sort of repriced itself as long as we stay on this security trend line or insecurity trend line. Apparently, Uchumi's postponing its rights issue, and that is probably a buy signal. Uchumi's market cap is $37.76 million. I mean, you would have thought that is very, very cheap. Even at 100% premium on the share price, I think it's worthy of someone just taking a pop at it. Once again, thank you. Wishing you a super weekend.